listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. Once again, we appreciate you joining us each and every week, as you always do. Before we get started with this week's episode, just a couple of notes. Again, follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Leave us a rating and review on iTunes. Guys, those reviews are so important. Please take the time to write them. Doesn't have to be a large review, just something that lets us know what you think of the program, how much you like the show, guests you want to hear in the future. Speaking of guests you want to hear in the future, send us an email. Producer@hazardground.com. Once again, it's producer@hazardground.com. And send us an email of not only what you think about the show, but if you have any guest ideas, know somebody you want to be on the show, or know of a story that maybe we haven't told you that you'd like us to research and find out more about, we'll certainly do that. So again, producer@hazardground.com. You send us an email, we'll get back to you. Also, I want to remind you guys about our partnership with Amazon. Go to our website, hazardground.com. Click on that Amazon banner right in the middle of the homepage there. Do your normal Amazon shopping. Whatever you guys spend, we get a percentage of. We take that percentage and donate it right back to some of the amazing charities you've heard right here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Now that that's all out of the way, let's get on with this week's episode. Joining us this week is a 13-year veteran of the United States Air Force, currently serving in the Air Force Reserves as a major. She was part of the former CST cultural support teams and deployed with the 75th Ranger Regiment to Afghanistan. She is also a Pat Tillman Scholar. She is Annie Kleiman, joining us on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Annie, welcome. Thank you for joining me. All right, Annie, so excited to talk to you. You are actually the second member of the CST cultural support teams that we've had on the pod. And look, I find that whole thing and that whole dynamic so interesting because it really is an insertion of females into a place where they've never been before. So it's groundbreaking, it's historic, and I love hearing about how you guys all get into that. But we go back to the beginning and tell us how you got into the military to begin with.
Yeah, sure. So I was a Civil Air Patrol cadet. Starting from the age of 11. For people who don't know what that is, it's Civil Air Patrol is the civilian auxiliary of the Air Force. If you imagine essentially a Boy Scout program, but with Air Force uniforms.
Oh, nice.
I think there's like an equivalent to like there's like the Sea Cadets, there's the Young Marines. I don't know if the Army has one that's similar, but kind of sort of a mix between like JROTC and scouting. So I started doing that pretty young and just kind of fell in love with what I thought at the time was the military environment, which to me was, shining shoes, putting on uniforms, doing a lot of drill and ceremonies, calling each other sir and ma'am, taking it very seriously, but just kind of fell in love with that whole environment, wanted to join the Air Force after college, so ended up doing ROTC, and then just commissioning straight out of undergrad from there.
Any particular reason the Air Force over any of the other branches? Did you ever think about another branch?
Well, Civil Air Patrol was based off of the Air Force, so that was kind of the initial bias. And my sort of perception at the time was that, the Air Force was maybe a little bit more focused on technology. I've always had this kind of a weird cognitive dissonance where like I wanted to, to be in the military, but not be like too in the military.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, sometimes it's almost just like dating the military, not necessarily marrying it, right? I mean, it's
yeah. I might get some crap from my Air Force friends, but.
All right, so you go ROTC. As you're going through it and you realize that, ROTC is kind of like an injection of steroids to the Civil Air Patrol stuff. Any thoughts of kind of, hey, maybe I don't want to do this? Is there anything else you wanted to do for your career?
No, I think I was pretty focused on commissioning in the Air Force. It was actually kind of interesting because when I did Civil Air Patrol, I was like very, very heavily involved and I was kind of at the sort of the upper levels as involved as you could be. So I was going to national level activities. I got to go to a course called Pararescue Orientation course where you were literally trained by actual PJs and you basically just you imagine a bunch of like 15 to like 20-year-old cadets and you're in the mountains of New Mexico where the PJ students actually do their training, and they're just kind of getting the shit beat out of them by actual PJ and SEER instructors. Wow. So I got to do that as like a, as a 17-year-old, was sort of was on the National Cadet Advisory Council. I was a cadet colonel. I was a Spots Award recipient, which is, a big deal as a Civil Air Patrol cadet. So I was heavily involved, and it was actually kind of interesting because the first couple of years of ROTC was actually a step back than what I was doing as a Civil Air Patrol cadet. So I was a little bored, maybe a little frustrated with the ROTC program, but was always pretty focused on commissioning in the Air Force.
Now, higher math tells me, and again, it's not my strongest subject, but 2019 now, minus 13 years you're in, so we're talking about 2006. 9/11 has already started. We're in the middle of two wars. What did your parents say when you were making all these decisions about a career in the military?
Yeah, they were, they were a little bemused, I think. We don't have a strong history of military service. Well, actually, let me back up a little bit. So my parents are immigrants from China. I was actually born in China, and we moved here when I was about 5. My father, and he's told me this story, and it's probably gone through multiple variations in my memory. So my father grew up in communist China, and the way he tells it was he had actually tried to become a pilot in the Air Force and had made it to the sort of the final selection round, and was not selected because his family was not members of the Communist Party. So for these political reasons. So he had sort of had this kind of history or a desire for military service, like from, way back in his youth. But by the time we had settled in the States and we're kind of living our lives there, I grew up in Utah, we really didn't have anything to do with the military. So really it was all just my participation in Civil Air Patrol and kind of falling in love with that. I think they were, a little confused. My dad was a doctor, my mom was a librarian. There was, sort of expectations that I would do sort of the typical, good Chinese kid thing. So like, major in engineering, could be a doctor, something along those lines. I did actually major in engineering. But so yeah, I think they were a little confused as to my choice of career, but really didn't really object to it too much, kind of mentioned it a few times. I think they were hoping I would do a couple of years and then get out and go do something else. But for the most part, they were maybe just cautiously supportive.
Tangential question that's really random. You said your dad wasn't part of the Communist Party in China. I thought everybody who lived in China was part of the Communist. I thought it was kind of like a prerequisite.
It's not automatic.
Interesting.
The way I understand it is I think you have to either apply or sort of be invited to join. And it opens up more opportunities. But some people, either chose not to or were never invited. Or whatever.
Stuff you learn. I mean, I thought it was just part of being born in China. You were naturally a communist. I mean, I don't mean that as a pejorative. I just, just like if you're born in America, you're kind of naturally a capitalist just because it's what's here. Anyway, I digress. So, okay. Once you finish ROTC and get commissioned, what's next for you?
So I commissioned as an intelligence officer. I had sort of
was that by choice?
Yes.
Okay.
Mostly. Well, that's a little bit more background, I guess. So I had my thought initially kind of going into ROTC was my very long-term plan. And you'll laugh at this is I wanted to be an astronaut. I was a huge Star Trek fan growing up. I actually still have a Starfleet uniform that fits me in my closet, as we speak. So I was interested in space, wanted to be an astronaut, but was actually not super into like doing sort of like scientific research on my own. I knew I wasn't going to become an astronaut as a pilot. I was too short, just was not my thing. So in my head, I thought, okay, I'll join the Air Force. I will, be like a physicist or do applied research in the Air Force. And that'll be like my pathway to be an astronaut. and then sort of realized as I was going through ROTC that, science and engineering in the military was not really a thing that you did while you were active duty. It was, something that the active duty service member would like supervise contractors or, like other team members, but it wasn't really necessarily something you did as an Air Force officer. And then we had this weird mix up where the entire graduating senior class for my ROTC detachment ended up getting assigned as communications officers. Every single one, and none of us could understand it. It wasn't anything that any of us had requested. And I don't know if my, detachment commander slipped a 20 to somebody under the table, but 2 weeks later, I was told that I had been reassigned as a developmental engineer in the Air Force. And 2 weeks after that, I was told that I'd been selected for something called the OPEX program, which stands for Operational Experience, which is a program where they take engineers and assign them to intelligence, I think security forces or missiles, maybe maintenance as well, to give them sort of a more tactical operational experience before putting them back into engineering, which was exactly what it was that I wanted by the time I was a senior in college. I'm not really quite sure what happened, the sort of mysterious administrative workings of Air Force Personnel Command. But that's how I ended up headed off to Goodfellow Air Force Base for training as an intelligence officer when I commissioned.
That's why the stamp on your backside says property of the U.S. government. You don't really get a choice sometimes. It just is the way it is. All right. So what's your first duty assignment and where do you go? I mean, well, actually, you have to go to school first, obviously, after you commission. And what's that? Just give me the long and the short of that stuff.
So I commissioned in 2005, had the summer off and then headed off to Goodfellow Air Force Base, in San Angelo, Texas, which is known as the, I think, largest city that's not connected to the interstate highway system.
Interesting. Where is it?
It's in West Texas.
Like Odessa, Midland area, or I don't know.
I'm trying to think. It's about 3 hours from San Antonio.
Okay. All right.
Just kind of, in the middle of nowhere. You drive past a lot of deer on your way to and from. So was at Goodfellow Air Force Base from about August of 2005 to, I think, June of 2006. Some of that time was just spent on casual, just waiting for a class to start or waiting for a slot in a class so that I could start. So finished out intelligence officer training there, and then headed off to Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska. I was supporting the RC-135 Rivet Joint, Cobra Ball, and Combat Scent, which are large airborne ISR platforms.
How quickly do you get to your first deployment?
My first deployment was 2007. So I think I was on station for about a year, where we were doing sort of typical, what the Air Force calls unit level intel support. So we were building current intel briefs for the wing commander. We were building, pre-deployment briefings for the air crews. And then also, just sort of internal training slides for the air crews. So teaching them about different, foreign fighters and radars and missile systems and stuff like that. And then was out the door, I want to say July of 2007 was my first deployment, but that was to Al Udeid. So it was just more like summer camp in a very dusty and hot location.
So Kuwait then? I mean, your first deployment's in Kuwait?
Qatar.
Oh, Qatar. I'm sorry. That's right. Okay. I get my Middle Eastern bases confused. So Qatar is a small country right on the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. It's a beautiful place, actually. I would highly recommend if you ever had the kind of scratch to go vacation there, you could. It's that kind of gorgeous. But you're not really doing anything there, right? I mean, you guys are so far away from anything that's going on. Is it kind of boring for the first 4 to 6 months there?
I mean, okay, so you'll actually laugh at this. It was only a 2-month deployment.
Okay. Well, I don't really laugh at it. And for those listening who aren't military, the Air Force typically has much shorter deployments than the Army or the Marine Corps. So,
yes,
Army deployments are about a year. Air Force are usually 4 to 6 months, correct?
4 to 6, it depends on the unit. What's actually really unique about the unit that I was supporting is these were RC-135 rivet joints, so they're flying sort of airborne reconnaissance missions. This particular platform had actually been continuously deployed since before 9/11. They were doing, Operation like Southern Watch and Northern Watch. So they had actually been, I think by the time I got there, this platform had been continuously deployed for, it was like 16 years or something. And it was actually a pretty tough ops tempo because it was typically 2 months out and then as short as 2 months home and then turning right around and headed back out the door again. So while they weren't gone for a long stretch at a time, they were just constantly going in and out of theater. So it was tougher, I think, on the air crews. They had like a more set deployment schedule, whereas the intel support, we would kind of schedule people as we could and try to give them some time off.
How much of that deployment like prepared you for what was next, or did it not? Was it just one of those experiences you just kind of went through and, for lack of a better term, suffered through for what you had to do?
It eased me into my subsequent deployments. I think it's like you kind of dipped a toe into it. It wasn't the full on where like I have to carry a weapon and I have to worry about, incoming rockets and all of that stuff. It was kind of like a helpful transition that like eased me into the idea of like, okay, I'm operating in a deployed environment.
All right. So when does the actual real first deployment show up?
So I did 2 of these 2-monther deployments to Al Udeid, and then in 2009 I deployed to Baghdad. I was there for 6 months, was supporting an Army brigade combat team. So I was there doing what was known as DOMEX, which is document and media exploitation. So this was with conventional Army forces. So as the patrol units were going out, if they were bringing anything back that they had found, in compounds or whatever. So cell phones, computers, notebooks, anything with any sort of writing on it. It was my team's job to take all of those materials, process it, get it digitized. And then we had a lot of translators who would then comb through all of that material and look for things of intel value. And then we would then take that, package it up in a report, and push that to the S2 shop that we were supporting, who would then take it, combine it with any other intel streams they were getting and push it to their units that were going out again. Right.
So you take the data, for those non-military, take the data and then turn it into actionable intelligence in which you can go find another target or search out other areas where bad guys may be hiding. When you do that stuff, what stands out to you as some of the more memorable things that you remember going over and going like, whoa, was there any of that type of information you came across?
We actually found indication that some of the local workers on the base that we were at had some ties to some other bad guys. So that was interesting. I mean, by the time I was there, it was 2009, 2010. Things weren't. It wasn't super kinetic. We were turning a lot of the operations over to Iraqi units. So in some cases, we were actually hoping for more work just to kind of keep ourselves, more occupied. If we're going to be deployed, we might as well be doing something interesting. But yeah, I think that was at the sort of the tail end of my deployment, where I forget exactly what the chain of events were, but we had basically gotten the phones of some of the workers on base and ran their data and found that they had, the term was, I think, nefarious contacts or something, but found that they were then connected with, other guys that the S2 shops have been looking at before. So that was kind of interesting. I actually don't know what the follow-up was because I ended up redeploying after that.
Gotcha. I was just curious, is there a sense of, I guess accomplishment is the right word, when you take all that information, put it together, and you could have, for all intents and purposes, prevented something really bad from happening?
Yeah, I mean that's the hope, right? Like we were just a very small piece in a bigger sort of intel apparatus. So the hope is always like, hey, maybe we found something that contributed and like had some sort of tangible effect. I do know that we had teams kind of spread out all over the country, so embedded with various brigades and battalions. I do know that some of the work that our other teams did, I think, resulted in actually taking one like an insurgent to trial, and being able to like prosecute the guy, in an Iraqi court of law. So we had some tangible results, but it's always nice to know when we're kind of able to trace that back to something specific that we did.
So you redeploy back. It's sometime late 2009, 2010. I assume shortly thereafter you come across the term CST, Cultural Support Team. When you come across those words, what's your first thought?
So there's a little bit of, I guess, background stuff happened in between then. So I got back in 2010, and that was when the Air Force was basically saying like, hey, you've had your fun as an intel officer. It's time now for you to come back and be a developmental engineer, which was, the deal that was sort of made when I first commissioned through the OPEX program. And the key, failing of that program that I think the Air Force didn't necessarily foresee is that everybody who does the program wants to stay in the operational career field, right? It's kind of a self-selection going on. People who want operational experience sign up for this program. They do it. They decide they like it. They want to stay. And the Air Force personnel system gets very grumpy when that happens. So I had put in a request to stay as an intelligence officer. At the time, the intel career field was hurting for people. We were pretty undermanned. There was just a lot of high ops tempos. A lot of intel officers were just deploying out the door left and right. The Air Force was filling a lot of in lieu of taskings for the Army. So the Army was, basically had these sort of the Domex job that I did in Baghdad, where the Army couldn't fill it, and the Air Force was taking intel officers and filling those extra positions. And the career field that I was supposed to be going back to, this developmental engineering, was actually pretty healthily manned. It was pretty close to 100%. There wasn't a lot of deployments. It just, wasn't as operational. And so in my mind, it made perfect sense to go, hey, I'm willing to stay as an intelligence officer. You're pretty healthy with engineering. You don't really need me. I haven't even been doing the job. You should just let me stay as intel. And of course, the Air Force came back and said no.
In all their infinite wisdom, right?
Yes. and then a couple of years later started offering bonuses for intel officers to stay in longer. And I was like, I would have stayed for free, but anyways. So at that point, my active duty service commitment was up. And so I said, okay, I'm gonna leave active duty. I'm gonna be a reservist, because I think I can do the things that I want to do there. I had applied to be an intel officer reservist for Air Force Special Operations Command, which was the command that my husband, who's a pilot, was serving under. So I'd gotten picked up to be a reservist, an intel officer with AFSOC. And at that point, I just said, you know what, there's better things that I can do as a reservist than as active duty. Now,
was your husband active duty, or is he also in the reserves?
He was active duty.
Okay,
yeah.
And the only reason I ask is just because I'm trying to tie it all together as far as, operationally how life is when you're not, full time and he is. I mean, obviously it's a different, sort of pace of life, if you will. Mm-hmm. So, all right. So you end up in this same unit with him. What's next?
So I, just a series of just very kind of lucky events, end up working as a reservist practically full-time at the Air Force Special Operations School, which is this kind of fantastic academic institution that does these 5-day long courses, mostly for Air Force Special Operations personnel, but also just broader military or government personnel in general, focused on regional education and counterinsurgency warfare and just introduction to special operations, sort of this whole gamut. I end up teaching there they handed me this course that they were planning on getting rid of because attendance wasn't all that high. And they kind of looked at me and said, here, take this course, see what we can do with it. And if it works out, great, we'll keep it. If not, no loss, we're going to get rid of anyways. It was the cross-cultural communications course. So they basically just gave it to me and said, do whatever you want with it, which was fantastic. And a little unexpected. So I got to take this course and we made it more operational, more focused on, specific issues and topics that, a special operator would care about while they were in the field working with, a host nation counterpart. And so I sort of had this reputation as like, hey, Captain Kleiman is like the culture person, like that's her thing. At the same time, I was also had like gotten into CrossFit a lot. And like most people who do CrossFit talked a lot about the fact that I did CrossFit. So people knew.
Yeah. It's almost a cult with you guys. You know that, right?
Yeah. So people that I worked with knew that I was really into culture and that I was really into working out. So when the announcements for the cultural support teams came out, I think I had like 2 or 3 people that I worked with who all forwarded me this email and said like, hey, you should do this. Like, this looks like it was written for you. And I was lucky because for that specific time period, this was around like August of 2011, for whatever reason, the Army had decided to open up applications to Air Force Special Operations Command. To my knowledge, this was the only time that this was kind of available, like institutionally, to a different service. There's been onesies, twosies of women from other services who have heard about the CST program and just managed to like move, heaven and earth to get themselves into the program, usually because they were able to get a general officer to advocate on their behalf. For that couple of months, it was the only time that it was just open to any AFSOC applicant in addition to the Army. So I just really lucked out with the timing.
So when you first, are told about it, I mean, do you think that this is a way for you to kind of, you feel like you're going to get back in and restart things up again because it piques your interest, or was this just something that was, as you mentioned, sort of serendipitous and it fell in your lap and I'll give it a shot kind of deal?
Yeah, I mean, it just sounded like something that was really cool to do. Like I had grown up in the military where the ground combat ban was just like set. It was just firmly in place, right? Like it was just a fact of life. And it honestly just did not even occur to most of that was something that was going to change, anytime soon, if ever. I had sort of always had kind of an affinity for special operations based off of that, my experience in Civil Air Patrol and getting, yelled at by PJs when I was a teenager. Just always thought that was like that career field and those kinds of jobs were just cool and interesting. But I'd always just taken it as a baseline assumption that those were things that were not open to me, right? Simply because I was female. And so I remember reading the description about CSTs on the website and like reading about what it is that they did. Just the chance to do that seemed, amazing. Like it was something that I never thought that I would have the opportunity to do. And as an intel officer, for us, like the closest thing, is the thought of like, oh, cool, I could maybe like be the one looking, at a UAV feed and telling the special operators on the ground what's going on. Like for us, that's like as tactical as you can get.
Right.
So, reading about what it is that the CSTs were able to do was just, kind of mind blowing.
You said earlier that you kind of liked the military, like, you liked it enough, but you didn't want to marry it, so to speak. You realize the cultural support teams are very much of a marriage, right? Like it amps things up to another level. And the only reason I bring it up is because, I mean, obviously you grow and mature, but was it one of those things where you ever thought, well, maybe this is a commitment I'm not, wanting to make, or was it just the excitement of the whole job that kind of said, screw it, I'll go for it no matter what?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I was excited about the idea. It just sounded like something amazing to do. And like I said, I'd always had this kind of weird cognitive dissonance with the military where I had gone into the military planning on a 20-year career. Right. But at the same time was like, well, I don't really want to be like, into combat. Like I wasn't like some of the other CSTs who was sort of like they grew up wishing that they could be in combat and wanting to be in infantry, and CST was sort of like the culmination of everything that they had ever wanted. Yeah, I don't know. I was weird. I wasn't necessarily like that. I wasn't like actively looking for a way to get into combat. But just for some reason, the idea of being able to like work with special operations while doing this, sort of very interesting cultural type work was just very compelling for me.
So take me through the application process. You have to go to assessment and selection and everything else. What was that like for you?
Yeah. So I think I heard about this call for application, from a couple of colleagues and, hemmed and hawed about it. I talked with my husband about it and was like, well, this is like assessment is just a couple of weeks away. I have courses coming up. We had all these other things. And I remember saying to him like, well, now that I know that, Air Force people can apply, maybe I'll wait for the next rotation. And I remember him just looking at me and being like, look, if you're going to do it, like, just do it, like, do it now. So the just even putting together a package for assessment and selection was, we had to do it was a 10K ruck march. We had to do the Army PT test, which is a little bit longer than the Air Force test. And then I had to get, I think, an 05 to like sign off on it. And I think I did all of that in the span of like 3 days. Like I took the Army PT test on a, Wednesday night. I think I did the ruck march on like Thursday morning, got the 05 signature on Friday, and like submitted the package the following week after that. And after that, it was a whirlwind. I got picked up to go to assessment and selection, which was up at Fort Bragg. I think I went TDY. I had one last course that I was doing, my 5-day culture course that was in New Mexico. We had a new contractor that was taking over the course, so like handed off the course to him, finished out that TDY and basically like turned around and went up to assessment and selection. Assessment selection was 5 days in the field. There's a couple of days at the beginning and at the end for, admin stuff. But it was an amazing experience. It was the first time that I'd been with dozens of other women in the military who were, who just had their shit together. They were strong, they were focused, they were dedicated. Yeah. And I remember like the whole week we would just keep looking around and being like, I didn't realize there were so many other people like me. And it was cool to see that for the first time. But it was 5 days where it was very physically demanding, but also mentally challenging. They operated in an environment where you just literally got no feedback. I was expecting to get yelled at. I was going to be doing, push-ups and whatever. And there was none of that at all. It was, we would, get matter-of-fact instructions written on a whiteboard, which we had to check periodically. And we would just be told what to do. We would do it. And then we would get told our next set of instructions with zero feedback as far as, did I pass? Did I fail? Where do I fall, in the rack and stack? Am I going to make it? Am I going to not? The only time you got any sort of feedback was for, sort of timed events. Like if you could see that you were the last one coming in for a run, or you could, count how many push-ups you had done or whatever. But yeah, besides that, it was just sort of like very ambiguous operating environment.
Yeah, and for those non-military listening, that's difficult only because everything we do, we have task, condition, and standards. And the last part of the standards is the standard of whatever we're doing, whether it's a training, a class, whether it's a physical event or a mental event. There's always some sort of, the military doesn't ever operate, or the conventional military doesn't operate without some sort of guidelines for everything. In the special operations world, it's clearly a lot different. They want you to operate in ambiguity because that's generally the environment that special operators work in. So from that standpoint, I certainly could see where some of the maybe confusion or frustration lied with you. What was it like with the other females in the class? What was the interaction like with other females? Because, had this discussion with a lot of females, and we talk about female progression in the military, and them being in positions of power, and how they sort of break the proverbial glass ceiling and things of that nature. But I've also run into a lot of females who tell me that the biggest obstacle in the military to their progression isn't males, it's other females. And it's other females who kind of just say, well, you're not as good as me, and I've walked through these steps, and you have to do what I do to kind of get where they are, because it's not that they're threatened per se, but, they don't want to make anybody's path easier because their path wasn't easy, so to speak, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I did not see that when I was during the CST program. At assessment and selection, when we were still kind of getting to know each other, there's some kind of subtle posturing, dropping like your 2 mile time or your, how much you squat or deadlift or whatever. There's a little bit of that. But I think for the most part, we were all just thrilled to be with a bunch of just really strong, awesome women.
I think that's awesome. I mean, I really do. I mean, and the other person who we talked to, Rachel Washburn, who's a previous guest on the pod, who went to the cultural support team, echoed the same sentiment, that there was just a different environment because it was so unconventional. And the fact that all of you were there, you realized, hey, not only are we groundbreaking, but this is just some cool stuff that we have an opportunity to be a part of. And I think there was a lot of empowerment there. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so assessment selection finishes. What do they tell you when you finally realize that, hey, I've made it? I remember they had this kind of very complicated setup where everybody would wait in one room and the instructors would call each person in one by one. And then you never saw those people again. They would exit, I think, via a different door. Wow. Was that freaky?
Yeah,
was that like nerve-wracking?
A little bit, yeah. And, I remember sort of like being ambivalent, like, well, if I make it, I get to do this cool thing. But, if I don't make it, then like, oh, at least I tried. And, then I can, go off and like do what I'd originally planned. My husband and I had started talking about like starting a family. So there's all these things where I was like, do I really want to make it? Do I really not? I don't know. Maybe I just want them to like force a decision for me. But yeah, so I remember walking up and the instructor kind of listing a bunch of like different categories. Like, you were like average in this category, you were above average in this, you were below average in this. I think I remember laughing because he had said like you were like below average in like logic and reasoning or something. And I was like, we were sleep deprived for like 5 days. What did you expect? And then at the very end, he goes, and you made it. And then I think at that point everybody who had made it had went out the same door. So then you could kind of look around and take a look at and be like, okay, like these are the other girls who had made it. Like now we're all like moving on to this next thing. So it was exciting. It was also, a little terrifying because if you didn't make it, then you just get to go home and kind of pick up your life where you left off. Whereas like now you've made it and there's like a billion more things that you have to start thinking about and getting ready for.
You walk through the door with everybody else who made it and you realize you're in the right room. Was there anybody in that room you looked at and went, wow, she made it? Or was there anybody in that room that you looked at and said, well, where the hell is, so-and-so? How come she's not here?
I don't think so. There were, for the next stage, when we did our 6-week training, there's actually another cut, which we actually weren't expecting of CSTs who were then tagged to deploy. And I think there was a couple of women where we were definitely like, damn it, like she should have made it, some of that was due to just, extra injuries or whatever. But I think for that first stage, I don't recall sort of second guessing any of those decisions.
Sure. All right. So you go through your second phase of training. Like at what point do they tell you, hey, you're going down range?
I think literally the last day.
Okay. Of the second set of training you're talking about.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So we came back after assessment selection. We had a couple of weeks off and then came back for 6 weeks of training. And they were never actually entirely clear. So we didn't actually realize that they had a set number of slots that they needed to fill. We thought that if you graduated from the 6-week training that you would then deploy, and it turned out that was not automatic. So I think like we graduated the course, and it's somewhere in those last couple of days we're notified we were notified actually whether we would support the direct action track or the village stability operations track.
Which one did you get?
Direct action.
Okay. Are you excited about that?
Actually, I had wanted village stability operations. That seemed to be more of the kind of the cultural stuff that I was specifically interested in. The running joke through all of the 6 weeks of training was like, hey, we're called the cultural support team, but for the girls who just really can't handle this cultural stuff, then they'll just go DA, and they can go kick down doors with Rangers. So I was absolutely not expecting to get picked up for the DA track. When
you find out that you are, and you have to, that's the route you're going, like, what are you thinking and feeling? Are you okay with it? Do you start to feel nervous?
Yeah, I mean, I was a little surprised, a little disappointed because I thought that the VSO track just would have been really interesting. But also the Rangers really didn't have a strong presence at the training, at the 6 weeks training. We had mostly, SF instructors. We were at USASOC at Fort Bragg, which is, more focused on the SF guys. And I think it was towards the end, and we honestly didn't even understand the Ranger mission that well. Towards the end, there were some folks from Ranger Regiment who specifically came and talked to us and kind of tried to explain the mission a little bit better, but we didn't go through the entire training with that understanding. I think for a lot of us, the way that the Ranger mission was talked about, it was, you'll go after the objective has been secured, and that's when you'll talk to the women and children. And for some reason, we had the sort of ridiculous mental image that the strike force would go out, they would secure the objective, and then we would come out separately later, which is not the case at all, right? Like we all were in the same helicopters. We, did infill together and everything. So I don't think for a lot of us, we even realized that you were actually going to be out with the strike force at the same time on the same night raid. Because the ground combat band was still there, right? So in our heads, we were like, surely we're not going to be going out with a strike force. That's crazy. That's not allowed. So when they actually explained that, there was this sort of realization of oh, holy shit, we're actually going out with them together. I mean, look, it's an elite historic 75th Ranger Regiment unit, right? So, you had to have some perception of what the nature of the job was. When you find out that, that's where you're going, does any of this at any point in time shake you and you're like, whoa? Yeah, I mean, definitely. I was definitely nervous, but I think the nerves were more, can I prove to the guys that I belong?
Okay.
Yeah, it was more of just, being able to convince these very elite male special operators that we were value added to the mission and that we, should get to participate.
It's a general sentiment, I think, of anybody who walks into that community, whether you're male or female. It's, can I not let them down? Can I prove to them that I belong here? Can I show them that even though I didn't go through all the same training they did and I'm not a tabbed operator, I'm somebody who can survive in this environment along with them. And I think that's the real challenge. And again, I don't think, because I was one of those people, and it didn't matter whether you were male or female. They just want people who can produce results. And they don't really care who you are, where you come from, what your previous job in the military was. They just want people who produce results.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had male enablers who had those same challenges. The advantage they had is that, their presence on the team was a little bit more established. So we had sort of the two strikes of we were enablers and we were female, and plus this was a relatively new program. So a lot of different interesting dynamics. Your
first deployment, 2012, you land on the ground in Afghanistan. Are you sitting here looking around going, what the hell am I doing here? How did I end up in this spot?
A little bit, yeah. So I remember we got to Bagram. We were there for like a day or two, waiting to get pushed to our fobs. And I remember getting to our fob, and the two of the CSTs met us at the helicopter to pick us up. They were already, they were basically like kitted up. They were in their mission uniforms, ready to go out. They were like, "Hey, we're glad you guys are here. We just came to grab you. We're actually getting ready for a mission, so just kind of follow us along, and we'll kind of like debrief you as we go." And I just remember the first day or two kind of feeling overwhelmed and was like, holy shit, how am I ever going to learn everything that I need to know to like replace these CSTs that are leaving? Like, they totally have their shit together, they're strong, they know their stuff. They know the guys. How am I supposed to like do what they do?
And how'd you overcome that?
I just kept my head down and I learned as much as I could, I guess. I had, a really great platoon sergeant who would answer, whatever dumb questions I had for him. The guys on the team were really good in terms of like being responsive if I needed help, but not, sort of being overbearing or kind of like babying me if I didn't. But yeah, just kind of kept my head down and took it one mission at a time.
They say to you, Annie, we're going out and you're going on your first mission. What are your feelings? What are you thinking? Do you feel prepared? Are you nervous?
My first mission was a complete shit show. So it was supposed to be pretty easy. It was like a 3.6K infill, which was pretty short, for the area that I was at. We were in, sort of Logar Wardak province, very high concern for, RPGs. Targeting helicopters, not as much concern for IEDs, which really meant we would land very far away and then walk in. So a lot of cardio workouts. So like a 5K infill was not out of the ordinary. So this one was, was pretty short. It was like a 3K. It should have been easy. We were going out in force as CSTs. It was actually three of us. Because it was me and my CST partner. We were each tagged to support one platoon each, because there were two Ranger platoons where we were at, and then the CST that we were replacing. So there was three of us. That was going to be easy because typically it's only one CST that goes out with the strike force, and in that case, you're doing everything. You're talking to the women, you're doing the searching, you're doing the tactical questioning afterwards. And in this case, we had three of us, so that felt like a total luxury. But I was just massively underprepared. I didn't eat enough before the mission. I didn't pack enough water. My interpreter had to like give me one of his juice boxes because I was getting dehydrated. We had these badges that allow us to get it off of our compound. And I'd forgotten, I had it on a lanyard around my neck, and I forgot the badge. Or I forgot to take off the badge, so that just sat under my body armor for the entire mission. The infill turned out to be more arduous than we were expecting. We ended up having to like climb over walls with ladders, and we were like jumping over ditches. I think like everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. My nods were fogging up. I was literally just like, it was fogged up so bad that I just literally could see like a green haze. And we were walking through these sort of agricultural fields where there's like, small little hills and ditches. And I was literally taking a step and just falling flat on my face, and taking a step and falling flat on my face. But it was, it at least like it was very hard to get worse from there.
Sure.
But yeah, that first mission was it was a goat rope.
What's it like on one of those missions where there is direct contact with the enemy, where, bullets are flying?
I was only in a couple of ticks. And, honestly, from my personal experience, at least, it was it was like not in the movies where there were sort of like bullets flying everywhere and it was close by. Like it was actually a more like cerebral experience. Like we could hear, we would hear the bullets, and, kind of realize that we were in a tick. But for me, I was usually far enough away from like the actual, path of the bullets that it was mainly kind of sitting and waiting, for the tick to be over.
As you're going through these missions and going through these experiences, obviously they start to get easier for you. When you look back on the experiences, anything stand out from a particular mission that stays with you?
Yeah, there's a couple of some interesting experiences, more just kind of like bits and pieces from different missions. There was a couple where it just like things got a little dicey. So I remember those. So we had one mission where we were going after a fairly high-ranking insurgent. Our intel guys had been tracking him for a really long time, and we were like getting ready to go out, and he suddenly changed locations. So it was this like quick flurry where we were responding very quickly. People were nervous because we hadn't mission planned for this particular location. We were just kind of rushing out the door to get this guy, and actually getting into a pretty substantial tick. But the mission ended up being successful, and that we like got this guy who's high ranking. We got a bunch of other guys. Like it was just like a classic like mission that went really well. That mission was a really great experience. There was another mission that was, a little bit scarier, where the mission itself went great. We thought we had gotten the guy. We thought we were going to be done early, and people were, happy that they could get back and hit the chow hall for breakfast. And as the helicopters were coming in to pick us up, one of the helicopters had a hard landing. And I remember, so I'm always usually lined up after the platoon leader, and we're, running towards the helicopter to get on. And I just remember we start running, and there's a huge orange flash. And I thought my platoon leader was dead. I couldn't see him. I had no idea when anybody was in front of me. We basically all just like did a 180 and started running the other direction. And it turned out the helicopter had hard and flipped over on its side. Everybody was safe. Nobody was seriously hurt. I think a couple guys got like minor shrapnel injuries. But the pilots were safe. Everybody was safe. But that turned into then a much longer, recovery mission where we had to regroup. They sent in reinforcements. They sent in more Air Force PJs. They ended up blowing the helicopter in place, and then everybody go home like several hours later.
Wow.
That was an interesting one. And then there's just kind of these weird surreal moments on that first mission that was such a shit show. I was standing in the compound, and suddenly like a herd of 30 goats just comes running out of the compound. And they just run outside the walls, and I guess they were going to go grazing or something. And then 20 minutes later, they all came around and like ran back in. And it was just ridiculous. There was, 30 Afghan women and children kind of huddled on the floor. Like I'm, standing in this foreign country, I'm kitted up, but I'm sweaty and I'm tired, and these goats are just running past me.
What was it like communicating with Afghan women and children, and how much of an impact do you feel you made?
So the communications that we had was usually very quick, right? And it was in very challenging situations. Like this was not where we were, sitting together in a circle and like sharing thoughts. This was in a very stressful environment where, it's 2 a.m. There are big, scary men with lots of weapons in their houses. And generally the way that we were taught is our job was to be sort of this oasis of calm and safety as much as possible for these women and children, right? I was the only female there. I had my hair down in a braid so that they could, as much as possible, tell that I was a woman in a uniform. And it was my job to if that they were really worried, to calm them down. And then also to, get whatever information I could out of them. So in a lot of cases, it was, a lot of one-way communication, me kind of telling them what was going on, me giving them instructions, I need you to sit over here. I need to search you all. Those kinds of things. But I mean, there were some interesting interactions. There was one time where the woman was just very, very concerned about the men searching her house, and she had a box with a lock on it, and she did not want the men to break the box. And she's like, I have a key. I'll give them the key. Just don't let them, break my stuff. So I had to I passed the key over. And they were like calm after that. Or there was another time where the women were like, don't touch my jewelry. I want to go get my jewelry. And it was my job to kind of keep those things calm. And I was honestly expecting sort of more resistance, right? Because if you're in someone's house at 2 a.m, I would expect that they wouldn't be very happy about it. But I mean, most of the women were pretty compliant whenever I asked them to do anything, which is not the case with some of our other CSTs. They had harder times with the women. And most of the women were actually fairly cooperative, which they could have been just bullshitting me to get me out of their house. But yeah, at least most of my interactions with the women were, fairly civil, as calm as possible in a situation like that.
What's the biggest difference between Annie before that deployment and Annie after that deployment?
That's an interesting question. Professionally, I think it has definitely sort of changed my career path, right? So I think professionally it, helps inform my thoughts on, gender dynamics, national security, policy, that kind of stuff. I ended up studying a lot of this stuff when I went to grad school. I talked about my CST experience when applying for grad school. I still pull on this experience a lot. When I do a little bit of work in national security, not a whole lot. And I think personally it's on the one hand, it's cool and kind of reassuring to think hey, I did this really awesome, amazing thing. And I'll always have. On the other hand, it's a little terrifying to think am I a one-trick pony, and is this the coolest thing that I'm ever going to do? And am I going to be able to find something else that, is also cool and interesting? I don't know if that answers the question.
Let me try it this way.
Too well.
So before you left, I'm sure your husband had some words for you. When you got back, did he notice a change in you?
Yeah, I think.
And not that I think you would be a dynamically different person. I just think perspectives change a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. We've actually had some interesting discussions about this. There's times when my husband and I are kind of talking to each other or, trying to get some stuff done, and, we're kind of not necessarily confused, but we kind of go back and forth between treating each other like a spouse and treating each other like a coworker or an officer.
Right.
And there's times where he'll be like, I'm treating you like an officer, like a special operator, because that's what I know you can be, and not as my wife. And there's times when I'm like, no, I need you to treat me like a wife right now. So yeah, there's definitely that. I think some part of that experience is also just kind of knowing that just physically that there were things that I did not think that I was ever capable of doing, and that I had these sort of self, preconceived notions or sort of limitations that I placed on myself without even realizing, and sort of being more intentional about thinking through and challenging those things, right? I went through, however many years in the military up until I applied for CST, never bothering to do a pull-up because it just didn't occur to me that I could. And then once I got to CST training and they were like, you need to be able to do a pull-up for the upper body strength assessment. I was like, oh crap. Now I need to actually do a pull-up. Whereas in the past, it just never occurred to me to challenge myself. So maybe being like being more willing to challenge some of those like baseline, preconceived notions. The fact that the ground combat ban was lifted like 2 years after I tried out for CST, when I was starting CST, like I just did not even think that was something that would change, anytime in the near future, and sort of being willing to challenge some of those more, what I had taken to be like established baseline assumptions.
Now that your CST portion of your career is over, if you were speaking to a group of women, what would you say to them about the CST program, and what type of person are they looking for?
So, I mean, there's sort of the basics, right? You have to be physically fit. You have to be, tactically competent. But I think they're also looking for women who are adaptable, who can work in ambiguous situations. They're looking for, at the risk of sounding stereotypical, like the quiet professional, right? The ones who just kind of keep their heads down, keep their mouths shut, and just, do the hard work. But I think I would also just tell the women that, like, you don't have to do the CST program. You can just go be a Ranger or go be a SEAL, right? Like the CST program at the time was groundbreaking because that was the only way for women to work in these communities and to do what these people do. And now, like, that's no longer the case, right? If you want to go work with the SEALs, go be a SEAL. And I think that also, that takes away sort of a security blanket for women, right? Like in the past, a woman could say, oh, well, I didn't work for special operations because I couldn't, right? Like because I literally could not, because of my gender, they wouldn't let me go to assessment and selection. That's not there anymore. And that's great on the one hand and a little scary, right? Like it's more of a gut check.
Sure.
Now if you're not a Ranger, it's because you
chose not to be.
Yeah, you chose not to be.
Right.
You didn't try. And now I think I would tell, women coming in, like, you have the chance to try. So now it's all on you. So
you're moving past all this in your career, and the Pat Tillman Scholar thing comes around. How do you end up connected with them, and what happens?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of the exact, actually, no, you know what? This is how it happened. There's a little bit of a CST mafia within the Tillman Scholars.
Ah, there is.
I mean, there's some very natural connections, right? So Pat Tillman served in the Ranger Regiment. A lot of CSTs served with Ranger Regiment. There's kind of that kind of natural connection. When I think it was actually our rotation CST 3 that kind of first started this wave. There was a couple, I think 2 women who were picked up as Tillman Scholars the year ahead of me, right? So as we're all coming back from CSTs, like you saw this sort of wave of women who were, either like leaving active duty or just kind of looking for other things to do, or like seeking to make some sort of a transition. Because I think for a lot of us, the CST program was a catalyst for something, right? And that was either like going off and doing like more super hua stuff in the military. So, Ranger school, special missions units, whatever. Or that was a catalyst to like just do something completely different, and pursue something in civilian life. So we had several CSTs who applied for the Tillman Scholarship and got picked up. And, we see this in like Facebook groups and updates and that kind of stuff. So I think that was actually how I first heard about the Tillman Foundation, was through my fellow CSTs. I applied for it between my first and second years of grad school. I got picked up for it and was a Tillman Scholar for my second year in grad school. And then obviously I'm still connected with the foundation just through other events and more professional development stuff.
Well, listen, to say that you've been part of some elite groups would be understating it, because both the Tillman Scholars And the CSTs are only for the select few, and you should be proud. I mean, understating it again, you should be proud of yourself for getting to all that. I mean, it really is. It's remarkable. Very few people get to do one of those things or be associated with one of those groups, and you were associated with both. So, congratulations is obviously in order.
Oh, thank you.
When you look back on everything, Annie, and you're still serving now in a different capacity, and I can relate to you in the sense that maybe nothing will ever match your time in the CSTs, whatever you do in uniform. I mean, I'm coming up on 20 years, and I still say my first deployment where I was attached to the special operations community, nothing has even come close to it. It's just been the best experience of my military, and I'm okay with that. I think that you get to certain peaks in your career, and despite the fact that we're always trying to get to what's next in the rank and in the job and everything else, because that's kind of the way our corporate culture is, if you will, in the military, that you always have to be kind of growing or dying. There's not a third direction. And to that end, I think that, what you accomplished and what you did, that special part of your life really, it doesn't define you, but it's a defining moment for you, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So in that, when you look back on it, fond memories clearly, but how do you characterize it in the scope of not only your career, but your life?
I mean, I don't think I would be where I am now without the CST experience. So I think it definitely, changed the trajectory of my life. It's not that I'm specifically, working on issues surrounding CST, but I think it gave me a launching platform to do other things. I'm pretty, I'm convinced that I got into grad school based off of, in part, my CST experience, because that was something that I spoke about a lot in my application. And I think there's, it's opened up other opportunities, just simply because that's something that I can draw on and talk about. And I think it's just also made me, more aware of other issues, in gender dynamics, in, national security, that kind of stuff. So I would say it's definitely changed the trajectory of my life. I have no idea what I'd be doing if I didn't do CST.
How much further does the military have to go with gender relations as it pertains to females?
I think we've made good progress, but I think we've still got a ways to go, right? I think it's tempting to say, hey, look, everything's fixed. Everybody, all the career fields are open now. We should be good to go. I think there are still issues. I know that there are organizations who are doing some really great work in this area. SWAN, Service Women Actions Network, WISE, Women in International Security. They've undertaken studies where, they've looked at the experiences of women, and especially enlisted women who are moving into these ground combat MOSs, and some of their experience is, frankly, just really terrible. They're running into just sort of outright discrimination and sexism when they're moving into their units. They've got male senior NCOs who are supposed to be the ones taking care of them and helping them out as they should any soldier, who are the ones, who are acting in ways that are not acceptable and based solely because of their gender. So I think we've still got a ways to go. I think we're making progress, but we're not quite there yet.
I, as a senior leader in the organization, part of me feels like it's my job to seek out females in particular for positions, given the fact that, again, the Army is only 13% female. But is that the right attitude or the wrong attitude to look for women in particular?
I think there's a careful balance there, right? I don't think it's wrong to not only women, right, but trying to, striving for diversity and inclusion in, lots of different aspects and not just with gender. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think the perception is so-and-so only got this position because of her gender or, whatever other background.
Let me give you an example real quick. I was looking for a company commander, and in looking for candidates, I specifically said to people on my staff, I want you to find a female. I want you to find a female. Now, she had to interview for the job, and she had to win the interview over everybody else, but I felt like it was my position to at least provide her with an interview to try and win the job, and she did. And to that end, I feel like and yes, I don't know if it's playing favorites. I just felt like it was in a male-dominated organization that senior leaders have a responsibility to at least afford women the same opportunities. And if I didn't seek her out, then she does not even have a chance to win that interview, one that she did.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, right? Because you were, you made the effort to get women to apply, and then they had to go through the same process to compete and then actually interview and win that position. And I think that's fair. And I think like in terms of extending opportunities where they then have the chance to compete on an even playing field, and win that position. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Well, it's an interesting discussion. Certainly, I agree with you. I think we've made strides, but we're nowhere near where we need to be as far as equal footing all around. And look, the demographics being what it is, as I just mentioned, how heavily skewed it is to males, I don't think that's ever going to change. But I do think that, if you continue to seek out females who can, you'll find that there are more than you think that they are, as opposed to sitting back and waiting for them to show up.
I agree. I don't think we would ever get to a 50-50 gender balance in the military.
No,
I don't
never.
think we need to. But I do think that, anybody should have the chance to, succeed, regardless of their, gender should not be a factor. And I think in many, maybe not many, but I think in a not insignificant number of cases, gender is still a factor, whether that's conscious or unconscious.
Annie, you've had an incredible career. You've blazed a trail, and you've certainly made a path for other females and other soldiers in general and airmen to follow. So from that standpoint, I congratulate you on all your success. I wish you nothing but the best going forward for your career. And all I can say is, Annie Kleiman, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Well, thanks, Mark. It was great talking to you.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.